This conversation was a mess from the start. Her stubbornness left the Duke with no hope of a good outcome, but he didn't give up on changing her mind. He just needed to figure out the reason for her refusal. It was easy to assume it was about money or the terms, but those were minor things that could be easily resolved. Goodness, he was even willing to go through fire and water to get her consent. She looked into his sincere eyes, feeling the pull of his gentle voice, but remained silent. It was hard to resist the charm of this main character. The Duke kept pressing because she was the first tamer Kuzan hadn't messed up. It was understandable why he was so persistent, but she didn't back down. She had her own goal in life, to live a quiet, peaceful life without bothering anyone. You see, 5 years ago, she started remembering her past life and felt as if she had walked into the world of a novel. She even thought that if she were the protagonist, her life would soon get better. But nothing changed. She was still an orphan, and a commoner at that. To be honest, she was lucky to have met a headmistress who treated her like a mother. Thanks to her, the girl was able to become a dragon tamer and find a great job. Except, she wasn't training puppies, but majestic and awe-inspiring dragons. And the dragon she was in charge of was no trouble at all. I mean, her Rue was a real beauty. You really couldn't take your eyes off the dragon's snow-white scales. In this world, dragons weren't rare. Some people raised them like livestock. Others kept them as pets, but no dragon was idle. To ensure they followed human commands, dragon tamers like her were needed because, some dragons breathe fire. Some roamed the depths of the ocean or soared high in the clouds. Everyone understood that these creatures possessed insane power and could destroy everything if they so wished. Meanwhile, Rue was being a little mischievous, grabbing the tamer's clothes. But there was no time for games now. Cleaning first, then other things. Soon, Rue's room was sparkling clean, but the tidiness didn't cheer up the sulking dragon. Rue could keep pouting if it wanted, but the girl had prepared some special treats for it. The trick worked, and the dragon was already begging for snacks, completely forgetting what it was upset about. Its puppy dog eyes melted the tamer's heart. She really loved this little drama queen and fed it well, happy that Rue was in a good mood today. But at first, the dragon had no appetite at all. Soon we'd have to see if it was ready to be ridden. Just then, a junior tamer ran into the enclosure. He desperately needed Licia's help. Thompson was in trouble again, still trying to tame that rock attribute dragon. And those were supposed to be the slowest and least aggressive type of dragon, or so they said. But something had clearly gone wrong here. Soon, that dragon would have Thompson for lunch without even blinking. The guy was already about to pass out from sheer terror. Just then, Licia appeared on the scene, riding her majestic Rue. Thompson immediately forgot his fear, as his hatred for Licia ran deeper. He yelled and cursed, completely forgetting he was only provoking the dragon further. Unlike him, Licia knew exactly how dangerous they were. But if he didn't shut up, she was prepared to leave him to his fate. Before they could finish, the dragon attacked. After growling for a bit, the dragon calmed down and even offered its paw to Licia. It seems kindness and treats really did the trick. A minute later, they were hugging like the best of friends. The dragon and the tamer were completely in sync, as if the meltdown had never happened. It turned out the dragon was just acting out because of pain, and Thompson hadn't bothered to figure out the reason for its unusual behavior. The other tamers watched Licia work her magic, unable to believe their eyes. Meanwhile, Licia was helping her dragon by removing a growth that was bothering it. It wasn't just any growth, but the seeds of some malignant sungrass. She didn't blame anyone, but her colleague had a different take on the whole thing. It's always easier to shift the blame and then bully someone because they're weak, right? Licia couldn't stand by and watch, so she defended the kid. I mean, he was a student, and Thompson was supposed to be his mentor. Why didn't he know even the basics of care? Her words were hard to misunderstand, but the guy played dumb, pretending he heard nothing. Licia didn't mind repeating herself. Thompson had saddled the dragon, ignoring its injury, which was practically begging it to go berserk. She was 1000% sure she was right. So the matter escalated straight to Supervisor Yashia, who was absolutely furious. But he was mostly angry at her. Licia didn't understand what she'd done wrong. She was the one who stopped the dragon from hurting anyone. That tamer had completely lost control, and camp regulations stated that when that happens, another tamer must intervene. Yes, those are the rules, but Thompson had powerful backing, someone who funded the entire camp. So if she wanted to keep her job, she had to watch her mouth. Licia had better remember that no one is irreplaceable, and no one would let her quit on her own terms, either. That was the other part of the problem. Though it was annoying to admit the boss was right about everything. The conversation ended there, and Licia left the stuffy office. The girl knew very well that the only thing she was truly good at was training dragons, which was why she was clinging to this job. Just then, she overheard Thompson and a few others bad-mouthing her again, purely out of jealousy. It was hard to hear those vicious rumors, but she had to endure it. Because she needed to help the children at the orphanage, she couldn't just walk away. Meanwhile, Rue's owner came to visit and was surprised by the female dragon's docility. Apparently, Count Albert was very pleased with the results. He was even willing to stay at the camp for a few days to reconnect with Rue, though he couldn't spend all his time on it. More importantly, the guy would be thrilled if Licia left the camp and started working for his family. But Licia turned him down, saying she was still inexperienced and had much to learn. Suddenly, Rue roared and reared up, ready to attack, but the girl couldn't figure out who its target was. Licia tried to calm it down, but Rue wouldn't quiet down. It turned out Duke Albrant had just arrived in Yasha's territory on his dragon. So the first thing the Duke did was head straight for Yasha's office and start going through documents. The guy had heard this was supposedly the best dragon taming camp, which was why he was here today. Yasha was practically ready to kiss Duke Albrant's boots, but the Duke didn't even bat an eye. The Duke planned to commission the camp to train a dragon. Yasha couldn't pass up such an opportunity, though he thought they'd be training a dragon for the knights. That's where he was mistaken, because the guy was talking about his personal dragon. In other words, Albert was looking for someone who could become his private tamer. The supervisor wasn't keen on the idea and tried to talk the guest out of it, as he could end up hurting his own dragon. To be honest, probably only the Duke himself could handle a dragon like that, and who knew what happened to his family's tamers. But the supervisor didn't need to worry about that. The Duke had already thought of everything for him. Besides, it wasn't their decision to make anyway. Meanwhile, Rick relayed the supervisor's message to Licia about a general assembly. It was strange. She couldn't figure out what all the fuss was about. Even though she didn't want to, she had to go and finish up the training with Rue and Count Albert. She saw the guy was upset, but promised to write down the recipe for Rue's favorite treats for him. Next time, then. Meanwhile, all the camp's tamers gathered at the first training ground. Licia was the last to arrive, which annoyed the supervisor once again. But she barely noticed him, as Duke Albrant had her full attention. Something about that guy really set off alarm bells for this protagonist. Just then, Yasha began his speech, announcing he had gathered everyone to select a tamer for the Duke's dragon. Participation wasn't mandatory, but anyone confident in their abilities could give a try. The problem was the dragons of Agric only chose members of the Albrant family, so almost nothing was known about them. This meant the risk of angering this dragon was huge, and it could even, let's just say, since no one knew its habits, things could get messy. Everyone present understood the risks, but they couldn't pass up such a huge opportunity to make a name for themselves. Licia hesitated. She knew she could win, but the duchy was too far from the capital, and she'd have to leave. Seeing her hesitation, Thompson immediately decided to mess with her. He thought she was just pretending to be smart and talented when she was actually nothing. Licia didn't take the bait, but her friend didn't think twice before punching him to shut him up. If it weren't for noticing the supervisor's fierce glare, the guy and the girl would have kept arguing. Only that made Thompson back off and stop bothering the girls. The friends talked quietly, and it turned out Licia wasn't planning to participate in the selection. Because of the orphanage, this protagonist just didn't get it. She should be living her own life, not worrying about others. Even the headmistress of the orphanage would scold her now. Just then, the drawing of lots began. Licia still didn't participate, as she had chosen a quiet life here. However, she would intervene if things got bad, but she'd rather not, because the Duke was too much like a male lead from a romance novel. Getting involved in a situation like this was just asking for trouble. The selection process continued, but no one could handle the dragon. Some nearly lost their pants, others lost their eyebrows, and the dragon was having a blast, looking very happy to be causing chaos. Licia comforted her friend, realizing that taming this dragon would be a huge headache. Meanwhile, Thompson was getting ready to join the game. He walked straight up to the resting dragon and patted its flank like an old friend. Licia was the first to realize what a stupid move that was. Her arch-nemesis took almost 2 days to start figuring out what was happening. The dragon's open mouth made its intentions clear. Someone's time was almost up. Licia had to act fast, so she used her instrument to draw the dragon's attention to herself. The other tamers realized things were bad and grabbed their magic gear. Meanwhile, Thompson just kept screaming, crying for help, and flailing around, which only made the dragon angrier. Licia couldn't let the jerk perish, even though it would make her life a lot easier. But her conscience wouldn't allow it, so she made eye contact with the dragon. She wasn't going to get any closer without permission from such an intelligent creature. The dragon was clearly warning everyone to back off, but it wasn't going completely berserk. But Thompson and the others were too dense to see the obvious. Save a guy first, deal with everything else later. So she waited for the dragon to calm down a bit and took a small step back. But it was too soon, and the dragon started roaring again. Luckily, nothing bad happened. It turned out the dragon just wanted a hug. Yeah, he could have wrapped his wings around her, but no, he had to lick her face and head with his sandpaper-like tongue. No one expected that, not even the girl. The Duke and the camp supervisor were equally stunned by the sight, but Albrant quickly recovered from his surprise, and now he was just disappointed in some of the staff here. He'd deal with that later, though. For now, he was more interested in the girl and his dragon. It seemed to be love at first lick. The Duke was pleased with her too, as she was the only one who actually followed protocol and won his pet's affection. That being the case, he was ready to put Licia in charge of training Kuzan. And now here they were in the supervisor's office, and she had to explain why she couldn't accept the guy's generous offer. It wasn't about Yashia being angry, but about the orphanage she cared so much about from her past. She had decided to help the supervisor and the young children at the orphanage so they could live happily without fear. Licia didn't say any of this out loud, but she apologized to the Duke and left after refusing. Albrant didn't understand her logic. She could have worked and bonded with the rarest dragon in the world, but she refused it all, and Kuzan probably wouldn't accept another tamer. So to decide his next move, the Duke started digging into the girl's file. The file showed she had almost never worked with dragons from the Yaxiao Empire. She mostly trained foreign dragons. Still, if things went south, the camp would lose a rather promising and talented tamer. To be honest, if it weren't for Thompson's dad, Licia's situation here would be completely different. But Albrant wasn't interested in this sob story. If a dragon rejects a tamer, the tamer is useless. Besides, if Yashia wasn't happy with Licia, he could always try training his darling himself. Yeah, and it wasn't even clear if Licia would become the Duke's private tamer. With that, Albrant concluded his visit. But as a parting gift, he told the supervisor he was leaving Kuzan here to give him a chance to get more familiar with the dragon. This news did not make the supervisor happy. So as soon as the Duke left, he called Licia in. Licia, on the other hand, was quite excited about this unexpected turn of fate, but she quickly sobered up, realizing it wasn't the best idea. Besides, she couldn't take on an aggro dragon when she already had too many dragons under her care. The fact was, no one else in the camp could handle Kuzan like she could. And since there was no formal training request, all she had to do was basic care. Still, Licia wasn't jumping for joy because it was Thompson who caused all this mess, and she was the one left to clean it up. But there was nothing the supervisor could do. You can't question the Duke's decision. You can only obey. So Licia decided to quit, but who would let her? Right? No one. I mean, the poor dragon she was taking care of did nothing wrong, and she couldn't just abandon them. It was a low blow, right where it hurt. But the supervisor had a point. If she left, the dragons in her charge would be completely lost without her. It was a tough choice, but also a no-brainer in a way. Licia agreed, but this time she had a few conditions. She knew how the supervisor operated. She would only be responsible for feeding, walking, and cleaning, and that's it. These were minor things, and the supervisor agreed immediately. Licia had just saved his skin. As night fell, an exhausted Licia brought Kuzan its dinner. She knew the dragon was anxious about the change in environment, so she wasn't surprised by its sudden outburst. Okay, the dragon was hungry, but it needed to calm down. Before it could get to the food cart, Licia stopped it with a single hand. The dragon didn't expect that, a human daring to stop it from eating when it was starving. But its roars didn't scare Licia, so she held her ground. The dragon had no choice but to lie on the floor and give her puppy dog eyes. Kuzan was so cute that the girl started to waver. She couldn't stay mad at such an adorable dragon for long, so she let it start feasting. Apparently, Kuzan was used to being treated specially. It sounded like no one had ever set boundaries for it, which was why it dared to be so naughty. The dragon finished its meal quickly, and Licia's hands were itching to start training, but she couldn't let that happen. She could take Kuzan for a walk though, right? As soon as she put the harness on the dragon, it shot off like a rocket. The dragons here didn't do that, so Licia yanked the reins, and Kuzan fell flat on its face. Seriously, how dare she do that to him? He was a proud dragon, and he wouldn't stand for it. But Licia was in a hurry to get him in shape and teach the big guy some manners. He hated it, but the girl wouldn't give up on her idea. While she was busy with her own thing, Licia didn't notice the Duke walk in and start watching her intently. It was pretty much as he expected. A girl like Licia wouldn't leave Kuzan to its own devices. As soon as the dragon saw its owner, it rushed over for a hug. The guy felt a little guilty for being late and not seeing his friend sooner. Licia found it strange to see the Duke so carefree and happy. He had always seemed so cold and distant before. She was so lost in thought that she didn't immediately notice Albrant was already talking to her. He could see she was taking good care of Kuzan, even if she acted like she wasn't. Still, he was really curious and interested because Licia had managed to win his dragon's affection. So she needed to remember that she could change her mind and accept his job offer at any time. And it would be interesting to see how long Licia could resist Kuzan's charm. These words unsettled her, and her pleas for help from her colleagues didn't get any positive responses. It was the same with Yashia. No one was willing to help her. So she was left to deal with her problems and the mountain of work alone. Even though she was dead tired, she still couldn't abandon the dragons and their owners in her care. Like with Rue and the Count, it was their last day at the camp, and the guy was upset about having to say goodbye to the tamer. The guy didn't understand why such a talented girl, the youngest tamer to pass the exam with the highest score, couldn't find a job in the Empire. Licia wasn't stupid. She knew that dragons played a major role in the power struggles of the nobility and the elite. So everyone wanted a talented tamer on their side, someone who would soon gain power too, because they could raise the dragon to their owner's specifications. But thanks to the supervisor, that was impossible for Licia. But she was still happy just to be with the dragons. Besides, there were few places other than the training center where one could access so many different types of dragons. The Count didn't expect Licia to be so unambitious, so he hoped she would value herself more and aim for bigger things. After all, the clearest water has no fish. It felt strange to hear such words and receive a gift, because Licia only loved dragons and didn't need anything more. Unfolding the scarf, she saw a beautiful gem, and for the first time in her life, she thought the Count might be right. Though it was probably all nonsense, she could sell this stone and try to hire a priest. Suddenly, Licia sensed someone behind her, but when she turned, she couldn't believe it was the Duke and her headmistress. It was strange, especially when a man let them talk and went to see Kuzan himself. The headmistress wanted to talk to her former charge. She had something to say, but she wasn't in a hurry to get to the point, just drinking tea in the girls' room. The lady was silent for a long time, but when she finally spoke, she first asked about the Duke's dragon. It was hard for Licia to describe the dragon. She always felt it radiated a red glow, perhaps because of the creature's special magic. He was really beautiful and smart, and it was impossible not to fall in love with him. The headmistress wasn't surprised by this reaction, which was why she really wanted the girl to become Kuzan's private tamer. After all, the lady had even heard in town that a certain talented tamer had tamed the wild temper of His Grace the Duke's dragon. Besides, the Duke had personally visited the orphanage, made a generous donation, and even brought a priest. The priest was happy to treat the children, so there was nothing to worry about. But it wasn't just the children who got help, but the headmistress too, which was why she was able to visit her charge today. This was the best news Licia had received in a long time. The headmistress strongly urged Licia not to miss the opportunity the Duke was giving her. An opportunity like this wouldn't come again. And she always felt a little guilty that Licia had to work so hard because of her, but at the same time, she was incredibly proud of her strong girl. Meanwhile, Albrant and Kuzan were cooling off from the sun under a tree, but they soon noticed Licia's arrival. The girl didn't beat around the bush and said she had considered the Duke's offer. The man was clearly thrilled that Licia had changed her mind. He was ready to go over his offer with her in detail again. The decision was made, which meant it was time to say goodbye to the children at the orphanage Licia cared for. She swore to the children and the headmistress that she wouldn't disappear and would write. But no one was mad at her, because the girl needed to learn to put herself first, and they would always understand and support her here. Melissa and Rick even came to say goodbye to Licia, as they had worked side by side for a long time and become friends. Licia was very happy to see them, especially since they brought a farewell gift that would truly cheer her up: news. It turned out Duke Albrant had filed a formal complaint against Thompson, and he was fired. This was fantastic. After all the goodbyes, the girl didn't realize she was a little late for her meeting with the Duke. The guy didn't see what the big deal was, since she wasn't leaving forever, and her contract included vacation time anyway. The contract was really good, and not just because of the vacation. She needed to get Kuzan ready for service in the Duchy's Dragon Knight Order. It was a good thing his Grace the Duke got along well with the dragon. But there was one point in the contract that bothered Licia. If the tamer deemed extra training necessary, they would receive a bonus for that work. But the guy didn't find that strange at all, because the tamer knows the dragon's condition better than anyone. So if Licia found anything wrong with Kazan's condition, she was obligated to report it and would be paid extra for that information. It all sounded reasonable at the time, but now the conversation kept replaying in her mind, even as she tried to stay positive. In any case, the contract was signed, and it was time to prove herself. Yes, the road to the Duchy was easy, fun, and exciting. It was the perfect place to raise dragons, no matter how you looked at it. She needed to calm down, but it was hard to do now that she was in a mini paradise for dragon tamers. It's just that the guards didn't share her enthusiasm. But Kazan recognized her, so she shouldn't have any problems. At that moment, the girl started to feel uneasy as the other men began to look at her strangely. Licia didn't know how she could have offended them so quickly, but she definitely had something to think about. Though she could guess it had something to do with bruised egos, since Kazan had opened up to her and started listening to her, leaving the Duchy's head tamer in the dust. Only now did she realize it wouldn't be easy to fit into this long-established team. But they had arrived, and the girl was looking forward to meeting different dragons. But when the gates opened, her hopes were dashed against the rocks of reality. It was so bad, there wasn't a single dragon there. Nor could there be, because Kuzan had lost control so quickly. To make matters worse, the head tamer immediately found something else to do and had no intention of helping Licia get settled. He ran off so fast Licia didn't even have time to call out. How could this be? What did she do to anger the heavens? And these people called themselves dragon tamers. How pathetic. Yeah, it's a super tough job, and you can't get along with every dragon right away. But to back down out of fear like that, that's just cowardly. Licia wasn't going to do that, so she first decided to lead Kuzan into its enclosure. But the dragons started being stubborn again. You couldn't deny how determined and picky it was. It wasn't doing it out of malice, but simply because it didn't understand humans. So she explained to it that the man wasn't mad at it at all. He would be back soon, but for now, Kuzan needed to go inside and wait for her. This was their first task. The dragon had to sit and wait, and she trusted it could do it. Licia herself hurried off to confront the Duke, thinking Kazan's condition was his fault. Albrant hadn't seen her yet and was talking to his aide. It turned out they had been having a lot of problems lately. Baskel pointed out that these problems weren't easy to solve, especially after the transfer of the title. The worst part was that many tamers couldn't handle the pressure and then quit. Yes, they were backed into a corner and had to take care of Julius Albrant and his wife. But this dealt a heavy blow to the Duchy. The guy had barged into his life when he was just a child who had lost his parents, and he couldn't put up a decent fight against that greedy scheme. Don't forget, every noble family once had dragons, which means they also had their own dedicated dragon tamers. In families with rare dragon species, the status of dragon tamers soared. But they're gone now, and Albrant needs to figure something out. The Duke's uncle believed that Albrant's loyal dragon tamers would eventually betray him, so he simply got rid of them all. But perhaps this new dragon tamer the Duke brought in can turn things around. After all, Licia is quite a unique character, and Pascal needs more information to decide on his next move. The Duke didn't have much information, mainly mentioning that Chasm seemed very relaxed around her. But on second thought, that's a bit incredible. Pascal knows that Chasm is super picky and would even ignore someone for years if it didn't like them. Meanwhile, an enraged Licia was heading to the Duke's office. Her entrance was nothing short of epic. The door was kicked open, letting out a screech like a trapped seagull. Burning with righteous fury, she was ready to roast the guy. It looked like this was going to be an intense conversation. She was here because she was hired to train Chasm, but things had already gone awry. For example, Licia didn't expect Chasm to have lived almost entirely alone since birth. But what's done is done, and she just has to accept it and find a solution. She needs to get the dragon used to being around other dragons and taking food from strangers. In this situation, it needs to be moved to where the other dragons are immediately. It's the only way to get Chasm to learn to interact with them. If we keep it isolated, we'll never see any progress. Albrant found it hard to believe, but if Licia was confident in her words and willing to take full responsibility, then he was willing to make a concession. Of course, Licia was prepared for this, but first, she needed to do a little prep work. Specifically, during the period when the dragon's enclosure was being moved, she would use the time for basic taming and obedience training. The guy figured Licia should be able to handle it within a week. This infuriated Pascal. Albrant didn't understand his reaction, as Licia herself had said she would train while the new enclosure was being prepared, and he hoped the girl wouldn't mess up her first assignment as a dedicated dragon tamer. The Duke really had a way with words, and the look on his face was far from sunny and peaceful. But Licia wasn't worried. She was confident she could turn things around quickly. The conversation ended, and Licia watched as the other dragon tamers gave her the cold shoulder. But there was no time to dwell on it, because today was the evaluation day for the basic training results. Turning this into a public spectacle was a bit lame, but she was desperate to prove the Duke wrong. A few minutes later, Licia flew to the training grounds on Chasm to meet up with Albrant and the other dragons. Now she had to see if Chasm would actually obey her commands with all the other dragons present. Of course, things didn't go smoothly. The moment the other dragons saw Chasm, they freaked out and started to cause a commotion. Licia knew she had to get the situation under control first. To start, she had the dragon settle down a bit. It was difficult for it to obey her command, but it was already trying its best. But that wasn't enough. The girl had it back up a little. Chasm reluctantly complied. This was a huge step. Then she had the dragon lie down. The dragon liked this last command the most, and the other dragon tamers watched in disbelief. Even the Duke couldn't believe his eyes, because until now, he was the only one who could control his dragon's impulses. All in all, everything happened exactly as Licia had said it would. It sounded like a compliment, but there seemed to be a hidden meaning. More importantly, Albrant didn't look happy, though he shouldn't have been. But that's how it was. Licia decided to think about it later. For now, the Duke needed to accept the initial results. Besides, dragons are living creatures. You can't completely change their personalities or predict their behavior. You could feel the tense, confrontational atmosphere between them. Despite this, the Duke appointed her to be in charge of training the beast tamers in his domain. Licia was stunned. With so many other dragon tamers around, why her? It turned out that in the Albrant family, she was the only one. The people she had met before were all interns who needed a mentor. It was a truly despicable move. These novices could mess things up and annoy the dragons. The Duke had no right to hide this information from her, and she let him know it. Today's training could have been a disaster. The interns could have hurt the dragons, and Chasm could have gone on a rampage. How could he be so irresponsible? But luckily, nothing happened, and Licia kept Chasm under control. Otherwise, she would have had to clean up the whole mess. The guy left, and Licia tried to understand how a family like Albrant could not even have a dedicated dragon tamer. She felt like tearing the place apart. How was this possible? The Agrixia dragon had chosen this noble family, and now it didn't have a dedicated tamer. She gave off the impression of being from some ancient noble family, but without the corresponding lineage. Her guess was also more or less correct. After those words, the guy shut his mouth and began to size her up. In fact, he had come to the cottage to find Licia and praise her for training Chasm so well. Now, however, he had witnessed quite a show, though he wasn't going to bring that up now. What he was curious about, though, was whether Licia remembered the terms of her contract. She did, but she didn't think the clause about extra work and bonuses would apply to something like this. So the question now was whether she thought the team's training level was sufficient to start working with Chasm. The answer was obvious to both Albrant and Licia. This meant that the trainees' training could be considered part of the dragon's education. But Licia was worried. Yes, she would get paid, but this was too much for her. The Duke was angry that Chasm actually listened to her. What's done is done, but the work had to continue. So the girl figured that a family like Albrant must have some special training techniques. She really wanted to look through those records. An awkward silence filled the air. Then the Duke grew curious about how much the girl knew about his family. The question caught Licia off guard, as she had never really cared for gossip. All her time was spent training the dragons of the former kingdom, so she paid no mind to the affairs of noble families. So the Duke decided to start his story from long ago. It turned out his family had lived without an Agrax dragon for 100 years, until one appeared for him not long ago. And before that, there was no legitimate heir in the family, which sparked a power struggle. You can probably guess what those false heirs did to their dedicated dragon tamers. Licia had a bad feeling, which only strengthened her resolve to train Kaisen and to teach her students. While she was doing all this, however, the moving of the dragon enclosure was put on hold, which made things easier. And so, the first day of training the apprentices arrived, but Licia could feel that they didn't like her. But the girl forced a smile, introduced herself, and announced that from now on, she was the Albrant family's dedicated dragon tamer and the assistant's mentor. You could see the disapproval, confusion, and distrust written all over the guys' faces. Pascal completely understood what the assistants were thinking, but each of them needed to remember that it was the Duke who personally chose Licia. Hyping her up wouldn't help, and neither would telling everyone to just relax and be themselves. That wouldn't work in this situation. Some were surprised, as they had never seen her before. Others were wary, as they'd had the privilege of escorting her here. It was a normal reaction to this kind of news and change. Yes, she was their teacher now, but she was a newcomer and knew nothing about the duchy's dragons. So she respected every assistant who had been taking care of these dragons. She was prepared to share her knowledge with them, and in return, she needed information about the duchy's dragons and the Agrax dragon. An assistant immediately joined the argument, asking what would happen if some clumsy intern annoyed the Agrax dragon. What's worse, Kaisen had nearly roasted one assistant for bringing the wrong food and almost torn another to shreds for being in a bad mood. They couldn't even get near it. Licia knew this was a deliberate provocation, but she believed that since everyone here was supposed to work with dragons, it was in their best interest to share information. But the guy didn't see it that way. He thought no one here wanted to be a meal for the Duke's precious pet. The red-haired man argued that since they weren't licensed, they shouldn't even try. Licia hated that attitude. To her, dragons were everything, and she was willing to believe that everyone present loved them, licensed or not. Besides, she didn't want to be the big boss. She wanted to work side by side with people who were as passionate about dragons as she was. That's why she wasn't ashamed to ask her colleagues for help. In that moment, she remembered the Duke, who had been convinced that if she weren't sharp enough, she would have met the same fate as the previous dragon tamers. It was then that she clearly realized Albrand was threatening her, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. Afterward, he turned and left, promising a considerable payment for her work, but she and the interns had to prove their worth. Otherwise, they were done for. You could totally hear the unspoken threat in his words. The meeting ended, and it was time to feed the dragons. Licia immediately understood that the intern was implying she should do the feeding herself. The guy was underestimating her, even smiling sweetly while saying nasty things. But Licia wasn't going to back down and returned a sweet smile of her own, hoping he was only talking about the feeding. She guessed right. If that was all, then the assistant could go about his business. She would handle it herself. After observing the guy's reaction, she drew some conclusions. Now she needed to get to work. They weren't the first to try and belittle her, and they were nothing compared to Thompson and Asher. They would regret pushing the dragon feeding onto her. While feeding one of the dragons, she noticed it hadn't finished its food and its scales were no longer as shiny. Licia was now furious with the interns. No one should treat a dragon like that. She was already plotting how to knock some respect and love for these creatures into the heads of those careless staff members. And the conspirators, oblivious to this, thought that since she was from the capital, she would run back any minute. A full week passed since that day. An intern approached the dragon, but it wouldn't listen to him anymore. Bruce, thinking he was clever, thought Licia would get into trouble, but turned out they all got into trouble because the dragons no longer obeyed their commands. The guy didn't understand what was happening. Just a few days ago, the dragon was docile, and now this. Just then, Licia walked into the enclosure. She didn't understand what was going on because it was training time, but everyone was just standing around doing nothing. The guys were already starting to stammer, not knowing what to say to her. But since no one was talking, she prepared to leave and get the dragon's lunch ready. Bruce noticed that the situation in the dragon pen changed at that moment. The instant Licia stepped inside, all the dragons immediately calmed down. Bruce immediately wanted to talk to her, but figured Licia was busy. Besides, she had to feed and train 30 dragons. Bruce realized he had really messed up and decided to be the first to apologize for his despicable behavior. But no one believed his apology, as his words sounded hollow. Nevertheless, she thanked the guy for unintentionally teaching her a lesson. Until now, all the interns have been pushing their work onto her. But as soon as things got a little tricky, they started apologizing. That's not how things work. Changing tactics, 2 interns decided to help Licia with some chores. But that strategy didn't work either. She wasn't going to solve their problems for them. She felt they had brought this on themselves, and now they had to face the consequences. She didn't care what happened to them. Licia was preparing food for the dragons, knowing full well that those guys would come running to her as soon as something went wrong. They tried to frame her with the feeding, but they didn't know that the tamer is supposed to feed half the food, while the apprentices feed the other half during training, so the dragons will start listening to them. But that was a big mistake on their part, and they would pay dearly for it. With most of the work done, she finally had time for Kaisen, who was sleeping peacefully in its enclosure. To relax, Licia decided to lie down next to it, because it was the only place she could get some peace and catch her breath. She had about an hour to snuggle with Kaisen. She felt so warm, calm, and happy right now. But Licia wasn't the only one who wanted to come see Kaisen. Albrant came too. But it was all because Licia was sleeping peacefully under its wing, and it was protecting her peace from any disturbance. The Duke hadn't expected things to turn out this way. He couldn't figure out why she was sleeping next to his favorite dragon. Just then, he remembered Pascal's report, which said the assistants weren't listening to Licia and she was doing all the work by herself. The Duke didn't understand why his assistant was only telling him this now. Pascal thought the girl saw it as an internal matter and wanted to handle it herself, even though she could have used her position to lighten her load. What a remarkable and strange girl. The Duke looked at her, unable to understand her. Kaisen growled as a warning. Albrant knew he'd better not wake Licia and just watched her. But he wasn't going to do that for long, because Licia was responsible for Kaisen, and if she collapsed from exhaustion, it would become his personal problem. The Duke left, but she still couldn't rest. The assistants were running around shouting and calling for her, which annoyed both her and Kaisen. An assistant ran in, almost in tears, saying they were in big trouble. It turned out all the riding dragons had run off. The moment the assistants opened the enclosure, all the dragons ran off, and no one could catch them and bring them back. Licia was furious. She hated incompetent people who only caused trouble for others, who then had to clean up their mess. The guy was already crying, trying to justify himself by saying the lead dragon had led the whole herd away. They tried to reason with the dragons, but they just ignored them. She could have stayed out of it, but her conscience wouldn't let her. Yes, they were just riding dragons, but if they weren't stopped soon, even they could cause a whole lot of problems. So she decided to take advantage of Kaisen's eagerness to prove its loyalty and had the assistant open the gate to the riding dragon's enclosure. Licia's mission was to bring all the dragons home. So she rode the dragon in pursuit of the running dragons, which looked a bit like regular horses if you squinted. The girl tried to think like a running dragon to figure out where they would escape to, with no one in sight. She had Kaisen fly higher for a better view. After a while, they spotted the entire herd below, heading straight for the fields. They looked happy and excited, but it was time to end the fun. So Licia blew a special whistle, catching the lead dragon's attention. As the herd slowed down, Licia and Kaisen swooped down, blocking their path. All right, party's over. Time to go back. Except the herd didn't think so. If Licia hadn't come with Kaisen, she would have been terrified right now. The Agric dragon made it clear that these mounts had better listen to its dedicated tamer. Meanwhile, the assistants were scared out of their wits in the mount enclosure, not believing they could get the dragons home. The guys knew they were in big trouble, but they didn't know how to fix it. Even if they rested and then chased after them on their dragons, there was no way they could force the pets to come home with them. They had to remember that the Duke could demand compensation for the lost dragons, and they were penniless. So they had to find a way to get the mounts back. Just then, another intern ran into the hangar, shouting that all the dragon mounts were back. Licia was riding the lead dragon, and when she was just a few yards from the gate, she had them open the training grounds. Not a single assistant could believe their eyes, but the girl had really brought the lost dragons back. Licia got off the dragon, but was in no hurry to speak to her subordinates. She couldn't understand how professional dragon tamer assistants could let a whole herd of dragons escape. What on earth were they doing? What were they thinking? Or were they even thinking at all? She was almost curious to see what kind of lame excuse the interns would come up with. Bruce decided to apologize on behalf of everyone, even kneeling before Licia and fully admitting his mistake. That was enough. She didn't want to be on bad terms with all of them. She wanted to work alongside them. After all, she had said from the beginning that she needed every one of them. She respected each of them because their work was priceless, but she also demanded the same in return. This time, Bruce understood and shook hands with Licia. Just then, Albrant arrived at the training grounds, wanting to know what on earth had happened. But he had already received a report, and the guy didn't think a mass escape of mounts was a big deal. Licia completely understood the Duke's bad mood, but she felt that since the mounts were back, and the leader might have even brought back some wild companions, it wasn't the end of the world. So she saw it as a perfect opportunity to let the whole thing go. The Duke, however, didn't see it that way. He believed the assistant's dereliction of duty should not be overlooked. Nevertheless, Licia continued to defend her colleagues, as firing them would only make the problem worse. And replacing them would be an absolute nightmare, as they knew the Duchy's dragons better than anyone. Rohanus hadn't expected her to defend the obviously incompetent guys so vehemently. Even so, he decided to make a concession. Since the situation was resolved, he wasn't going to be too harsh on the guys. He would dock their pay for a year, and if they couldn't prove their value to the Duchy during that time, they would be fired. It was a rather light sentence, and every intern was grateful to the Duke. It was then that Bruce realized they had basically gotten off easy, because with Albrant's wealth and influence, he could have replaced any of them at any time. If Licia hadn't stood up for them, the interns would have met a terrible fate. And with that, the investigation was over. Licia was exhausted, so the Duke found her asleep under his dragon's wing again. The guy didn't understand why she was sleeping here again, especially when the dragon was so sure she had fallen for its charms. Rohanus just didn't believe it. More importantly, he felt the dragon was getting too comfortable and she needed a change of scenery. No one wanted Licia to get sick and never come back. Chasm resisted a little, but the guy was no longer asking for its opinion. He held her in his arms, thinking that when a person is pushed to their limit, their true nature is revealed. Everything that happened in the Duchy was planned. The point was to find out what kind of person Licia was, because being talented and being reliable are two different things. A lot of things made sense now. Albrant's first priority was to get her treated, as he had already ordered the servants to treat her according to her status as the Duchy's sole dedicated dragon tamer. After all, not only did she bring back the escaped dragons, but she also brought back a few wild ones. And Chasm listened to her. All doubts about her had vanished, and the question became, how had she managed to live in the shadow of other dragon tamers until now? Why was she clinging to him so tightly? He figured she was not only exhausted, but also terrified by everything that had happened. Morning came, and Licia woke up in a completely unfamiliar place. It was a beautifully decorated room in the Duke's main residence. But the fear and confusion quickly faded, and Licia, like a character from some trashy novel, started spouting nonsense. Seriously, she had to figure out where she was. The last thing she remembered was falling asleep in the dragon's enclosure. Just then, the butler entered the room with a large amount of food, saying the Duke wished for her to rest well today. The lady only now realized that someone had changed her clothes, put her in bed, and now they were whining and dining her, forcing her to rest. This didn't feel right, and she started to worry about Chasm. But the Duke appeared, saying he had personally taken care of her dragon. She found the guy a bit strange, even suggesting they eat together. Honestly, she felt too awkward to swallow anything, but her appetite was surprisingly good. Rohanus didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He just wanted to know if it was really safe to sleep next to Chasm. She knew she probably shouldn't, but its scales were just too warm, and she couldn't resist. The explanation was unexpected. The guy told her not to do it again. Besides, training Chasm was just an excuse. He had been looking for a permanent, dedicated dragon tamer for the Duchy all along. He was curious if Licia really thought Grick-type dragons needed to live in groups. Licia did think so. Socialization was important, as was the ability to live in a herd. This surprised the guy. It was because Chasm wasn't a wild dragon. It lived among people. If it started hurting people, there was only one solution, and it was one the Duke was reluctant to see. That is, if that happened, the dragon would have to be put down. If Albrant didn't want that, he needed to do things her way. Even if Rohanus refused, what could he do in the face of a direct order from the royal family? You have to understand, a dragon known as a living volcano could cause serious problems, and the Duke couldn't just ignore it. Licia knew she was being a bit harsh, but the human world just wasn't a suitable place for dragons to live. The fact that no accidents had happened so far just showed how much the Duke cared. Therefore, as a contracted dragon tamer, she would do her utmost for Chasm. So Rohanus needed to seriously consider her proposal. This was not the breakfast conversation Albrant had been expecting, definitely not. After that awkward moment, Licia wondered how long her personal vacation would last. She was only expecting a week, not a day more. Licia felt that was too long. She wasn't used to relaxing, and Chasm needed her attention. No need to worry about that. The Duke was handling it personally. After that, the young man left, leaving Licia alone, not knowing what to do next. She could tell the guy genuinely cared about the dragon, but every time they started talking, they would skillfully avoid the main point. It was a bit frustrating, but for now, she just wanted to relax and have some fun. 3 days later, the girl ran into him in a hallway near his mansion's library. Judging by the look on his face, something strange had happened to him. It seemed her vacation was about to end early. Albrant didn't budge, showing no weakness, and insisted the girl needed to continue resting. He wouldn't assign work to someone who hadn't fully recovered their strength. If that was the case, she planned to keep relaxing, but something bothered her as the Duke looked sick. Another 2 days passed, and Licia was sunbathing, but the assistants couldn't handle things without her and were begging for help. It turned out they were having some trouble with the dragons. Well, this was interesting. The guys had followed her feeding plan without issue, but Chasm was screaming its lungs out every night. So some of the more sensitive dragons were frightened by the screaming and developed some minor, easily treatable problems. The assistant was terrified and didn't know what to do. Rohanus said he could handle his own dragon, but Chasm just wouldn't stop screaming and couldn't be calmed down. This was a problem. Licia had thought everything was under her control, and it felt awful to realize she was wrong. So she and the assistant quickly prepared a riding dragon and set off to handle the situation. A few minutes later, she arrived at Chasm's location and found the Duke completely exhausted. But that didn't matter because Chasm ran up to her and, as usual, licked her head. She hadn't come just for cuddles. No self-respecting dragon tamer would stand by while their dragon was misbehaving. Honestly, everything was obvious to her. Chasm and Albrant were too alike, like two sides of the same coin. In that moment, she also realized the dragon was angry because she hadn't come to see it sooner. It missed her. It was then that it dawned on her that the Duke had never intended to accept anyone other than Chasm and himself from the very beginning. Time passed, and Licia got down to business. She mused that the Duke's behavior was beyond noble. After all, he had raised Chasm for over 10 years, and now it listened to someone else more than it listened to him. No wonder she always saw distrust in his eyes. It must have been painful for him, feeling like a kind of betrayal. She had read in books that those chosen by a dragon develop deep feelings and form a special bond, and it seemed that was the case between her and Kaisen. This was partly her fault too, as she hadn't considered that a dragon might behave this way. The atmosphere between them became awkward that day, and the Duke told her to take the rest of her vacation, as he couldn't calm Kaisen down himself. Now, more than ever, Licia understood that she couldn't mess this up. A private trainer should have corrected some of its behavioral issues when the dragon was young, but no one had ever told Albrant or the dragon that. Sigh, and she had to bathe the dragon today. If only there was a lake, she could just throw the dragon in and the problem would be solved. Seeing the girl sulking, Kaisen tried to cheer her up, but she just told him to go away. But the dragon was determined to wear her down until she gave in, screaming and darting all over the place like a spoiled brat. The thing was, the whistle brought Kaisen to his senses. If he wanted affection, he could go to the Duke. Licia wasn't going to spoil him. Kaisen was hurt, but Licia didn't waver, even though she desperately wanted to hug him too. It was the right decision. The dragon and its master couldn't jeopardize their fragile bond because of her. Meanwhile, Albrant also appeared in the park, completely unprepared for a dragon to pounce on him. It came out of nowhere, knocked its master to the ground, and started licking his face non-stop. Licia stumbled upon this silly scene of theirs, hoping the Duke hadn't changed his mind about correcting the dragon's behavior. Albrant didn't back down, but he didn't think this could be solved all at once. He gazed into Kaisen's eyes, confused as to why his dragon was so happy. Just yesterday, it had been disobedient, constantly crying and calling for Licia. But now, he felt like a child again, as if his little dragon had returned, and they were together like before. The Duke could feel Kaisen's joy, the joy of seeing him. Lithia noticed it too and decided to leave them alone and go work with the assistants. But before she could take a step, the Duke called out to her and apologized. The guy knew he had messed up. It was just that Kaisen had never cried for anyone before, and it broke his heart to hear and see it like that. Lithia completely understood, and as Kaisen's private trainer, it was her job to handle such things, so it was no big deal. With that said, she left, knowing she had done a good job. Lithia could finally breathe a sigh of relief, even if only for a moment. Albrant watched her straight back as he hugged Kaisen, realizing they finally had a private trainer. Meanwhile, in the paddock on the other side, it was a busy scene. The assistants were cleaning the enclosures, while the dragons were active in the field. This was good news, but the girl had other things on her mind. The training would start tomorrow, but today she wanted to check on the dragon's condition. Overall, the situation seemed pretty good. The dragons were all taking turns for a stroll, except for Lord Boskal, who always walked his pet himself. There was a rumor that Duke Albrant had personally found and delivered that dragon for his aide, who was also his childhood friend. Suddenly, Lithia heard a strange sound. One of the dragons had become aggressive. When she reached out her hand to the dragon, the apprentices were terrified, but she was unharmed. She just wanted to know who was in charge of that dragon. She didn't have to call a second time before the apprentice came over. She needed to find out if anything unusual had happened to this dragon recently. Louis was always super sensitive and reacted strongly to everything around him, all because this dragon had already changed owners once. That incident happened when the duchy was mired in a serious power struggle. Bruce didn't know the details either, which was probably why he was still alive. But he had heard that Louis's trainer and owner at the time had both died. Now, many of the dragon's behaviors were explained, as it instinctively understood that its old master wasn't coming back. The assistants were also sad to see Louis suffer, so they would be very happy if Lithia could help it accept its new owner. Good question. Lithia wasn't sure either. First, she needed to meet Louis's owner, Lady Durna. That woman was the Albrant family's only alchemist. The girl decided to take this problem to the Duke. You have to start somewhere, right? Besides, Albrant needed to know that all his dragons had problems, and Louis was the most urgent among them, and it was very likely to cause trouble soon. Unfortunately, the guy himself had vaguely sensed a similar situation, as he was always surrounded only by assistants. But for so long, they had all managed to avoid any trouble. Lithia believed all the apprentices would become excellent trainers. She thought it was entirely feasible to get them all certified within a year, especially since they could raise dragons well under such humble conditions. It was then that Lithia realized she should persuade the Duke, not turn the conversation into a battle of wills. Fortunately, the Duke decided not to interfere. He thought that if Lithia was so confident, she could accomplish this impossible task. This was because she knew better than anyone here how things should be handled. He trusted her, even when it came to Kaisen. After receiving the Duke's order, Lithia went to Lady Durna's laboratory and found her completely immersed in her research. Even if the woman was unwilling to cooperate, she wouldn't defy the Duke's written order. After a while, she found the right room and knocked on the door. It took a long time for the door to open, and finally, a girl appeared at the doorway. Durna was a beautiful dark-haired woman, but she didn't understand why Lithia was pulling her away from her work. The girls introduced themselves, and then Lithia handed the Duke's order to the alchemist. Durna reluctantly let Lithia into her office, and it was then that Lithia was stunned by the sight before her. A complete disaster zone, with not even a place to sit. They managed to clear a spot for Lithia to sit, and then she got to the point, the dragon, Louis. At that moment, Durna's expression completely changed. Lithia attributed this to concern for her pet and offered a training session to improve its condition, adding that it would be even better if Durna could also attend. Suddenly, Lithia felt something was suspicious and asked the girl how many times a week she visited her dragon, and whether she cared about Louis at all. Now, it was crucial for Lithia to find out if Durna cared about the dragon. When she didn't get an answer, the trainer suggested the girl either give the dragon to someone else or actually start training it. Just then, the alchemist erupted, shouting that she wouldn't give her dragon to anyone. Now, it was Lithia's turn to be silent. She often encountered owners who screamed they would never give up their pets, yet treated them like trash. Here we go again. The alchemist stubbornly defended her right to own Louis, but she wasn't taking care of it at all. Now she had to make a decision. If she wanted to change the situation, she had to attend the training. If not, the dragon would be better off with someone else. The girl's face fell. She explained that she had tried to connect with Louis, but it wouldn't open up to her. Then an accident happened. Louis inflicted a potentially fatal wound. Fortunately, it wasn't fatal, but the scar remained. Licia definitely hadn't expected such a turn of events. The trainer quickly composed herself and once again suggested finding a new owner for the dragon, but her companion refused again. In the past, Louis had been Durna's father's dragon. She really wanted to be friends with the dragon, but now all she could remember was how it had hurt her, and she couldn't muster the courage to get close. Meanwhile, Kaisen and Albrant were having a great time. Just then, Licia approached them with a report. Things were complicated, so she needed some extra artifacts. Louis was the current cause, but from her tone, the Duke could tell this was just the tip of the iceberg. If these artifacts were needed for just one dragon now, it was only a matter of time before the other dragons needed them too. Suddenly, the conversation took a turn. The Duke admitted he knew about Durna's injury, and that was why he had fired the previous trainer. But it wasn't just a simple dismissal. To understand this, you have to remember that the Durna family had worked for the Albrant family for many years, and they had always studied alchemy, which meant they passed secret knowledge to their heirs. Now Licia had to figure out the motives of the trainers who tried to get close to Louis. That's right, every one of them was sent by the Duke's enemies, wanting to eliminate all the alchemists here. When the attack happened, Albrant explained everything to Durna, but she didn't listen. She was terrified by the attack itself. If there was anyone who could understand the alchemist, it definitely wasn't Licia. On the other hand, she felt sorry for Durna, because she blamed herself for everything instead of the trainer who had caused the chaos. Besides, a dragon that has lost its master can't easily forget them and accept someone else. Its heart was now tightly closed, and it was hard to say how strong this wall was. Durna felt it too. She felt sorry for the dragon, and it broke her heart, especially when it cried. This was why she didn't want to give the dragon away, because she had also lost someone close. They were the same, but Durna couldn't convey her feelings to Louis. Now, they needed to find a way to solve everything. Kaisen and Albrant looked at Lithia's anxious expression, but didn't know how to help her. They unanimously decided that Kaisen should give her a hug to cheer her up. Licia immediately perked up, realizing she had made the adorable Kaisen worry. This support was good medicine for the trainer, and the dragon felt pretty good about itself too. But then she suddenly went from gentle to angry, ordering Kaisen to go get a hug from the Duke. She wasn't being whimsical. It was because she was a professional. Yes, she liked dragons, but it shouldn't affect her work. Besides, if you get too attached to a dragon, it's excruciating to let go when the training is over. The Duke hadn't thought about it from that perspective, so he blushed and allowed Licia to give Kaisen a little more affection than she did the other dragons. Well, that was really unexpected, especially coming from Albrant. But the guy didn't back down, even though Licia was glaring at him with a serious death stare. If the Duke agreed, why should she deny herself a little fun? Besides, Kaisen had been in low spirits lately. Just a moment ago, she could see the dragon was dejected. A little warmth in her voice made the dragon beam with joy. Licia praised it for waiting patiently and promised it a delicious treat as a reward. Besides, the Duke himself had given her the green light, and she wasn't going to pass up such an opportunity. And she definitely didn't want to offend the Duke for no reason. After her walk with Kaisen, Licia went to check on Louis. The dragon was in bad shape. Even the calming incense had little effect on it. Since that didn't work, Licia had Russell change the enclosure's door to a transparent one. After some simple adjustments, Licia could see Louis clearly. It was then that she had a clever idea. Place a table and chair near the enclosure so she could spend more time with the dragon. She only planned to pay attention to Kaisen when needed. Otherwise, all her time would be spent on Louis. Until today, it had been Russell who took care of Louis. The dragon had restrained itself from attacking him, but it was clear it didn't like him very much. Russell left, and Licia knew Louis was very unhappy with the current situation, but it needed to understand that shutting everyone out was not the solution. Time passed, and when it was time to walk Kaisen, it immediately smelled the scent of another dragon on Licia and was a little displeased. However, its anger wasn't too severe, and it didn't show any aggression, which meant it could eventually get used to the presence of other dragons. 2 weeks passed like this. Licia brought Louis food in the morning, and Russell brought it at night. The rest of the time, the girl just sat by Louis's enclosure, doing nothing. This helped to close the distance between them. It used to lie in the corner, but now the dragon would stick its nose out to smell her. Kaisen pulled the girl back from her thoughts. It seemed to be tired from walking, but then she discovered that the dragon had picked a bouquet of daisies for her, and she was as happy as a child. If she didn't know this was a damn egg-lax dragon that everyone feared, she would never have believed it. Gradually, she studied this type of dragon through Kaisen. These days, its habits often reminded her of a spoiled brat. This idea gave Licia inspiration for an experiment. She decided to take Durna to see Louiswis. The trainer understood the alchemist's fear, but she needed to test an idea. Besides, she would be there the whole time, so nothing bad would happen. So, the girl stood near the dragon. She was scared out of her wits, but she mustered the courage to say hello. Louiswis didn't attack, but it looked extremely wary, and the dragon's patience was about to run out. Lithia's intuition was right. Louiswis roared, indicating that a peaceful conversation was no longer possible. Then Louiswis lunged at the bars, and in that moment, Licia realized Louiswis wanted to kill Durna. Wait, the dragon didn't want to kill its owner. It wanted to kill Licia. This discovery was a heavy blow to the trainer. Something had to be done. Licia came up with an idea. Have Durna push her as if trying to drive her out. This way, the girl could hide, and the alchemist could talk to her dragon. Easy peasy. The protagonist knew her new friend was scared, but this was necessary to build a relationship with the dragon. Durna tried to do as Licia asked, but looked utterly ridiculous. Unsurprisingly, Licia told her to try again. Louiswis had no idea what was happening. The girl couldn't be afraid of hurting the trainer. The most important thing was to make the dragon believe its owner was attacking the trainer. The girl gathered all her strength and will and gave Licia a pretty forceful push this time. The protagonist almost actually fell. This was exactly the effect they needed. The trainer mouthed words of encouragement to the girl. The performance continued, with Licia saying she would go out, but if Durna needed any help, she shouldn't hesitate to call her. The trainer hid, and the alchemist began to observe her dragon, which no longer showed any aggression. Now she was supposed to say some kind words to her dragon in a calm, gentle voice, but she was too scared. The feeling of fear was stronger than any other, so she couldn't say anything and just ran away from the dragon. She had run away again, leaving Louiswis alone once more, completely disregarding its feelings. The girl knew she had messed up, so she was very hard on herself after returning to her office. Meanwhile, Licia tried to calm her down, making her understand that it wasn't the alchemist's fault. Ultimately, neither Louiswis nor the girl could be blamed for their actions. The real culprit was miles away. Besides, Durna needed to realize that Louiswis didn't hate her. Yes, it was aggressive, but it had its reasons. But this time, Licia was the target of its attack, and that was the crazy part. Because before Durna appeared by Lithia's side, Louiswis had always been obedient to the trainer's commands. But Durna remembered that Louiswis always ignored her commands, and that was the crux of the whole problem. The dragon didn't see Durna as its master. It had its reasons, its own justification, but she hadn't really tried to change that. To make progress on this, she needed to continue what she was doing. Licia herself wasn't sure if the alchemist could really connect with the dragon. After all, it was the only thing her father had left behind. Licia didn't have a clear answer either, or any guarantee that this would work. But if Durna didn't back down, Licia would do everything in her power to help her. The alchemist knew she had a long way to go, but she asked the trainer to meet her halfway and lend her a hand, because she wasn't going to give up just like that. She wasn't willing to give up on Louiswis. Meanwhile, Louiswis was struggling with the fact that its new owner was a girl, a fragile thing, the descendant of its former master. In those dark days, its former master disappeared, and the dragons close to it died, coughing up their own blood. Back then, this girl couldn't protect anyone. Now things were starting to change drastically. She was still scared, but she was approaching its enclosure. She even tried to give it orders in that imperious tone. And now, it was becoming harder and harder to disobey her commands. For a moment, Louiswis almost thought it saw her father, instead of a little girl. Louiswis knew very well that its master was dead, which was why hearing the familiar tone in her voice was so unsettling. Licia and Kaisen watched from the side, and the trainer felt she needed to intervene and teach Louiswis a lesson. Just then, Durna turned around and saw Licia enter the room. But the girl hadn't come to the meeting alone. she had brought Kaisen with her. For the first time ever, Durna saw the Duke's private dragon up close. It had to be said, the dragon really knew how to make an entrance. Its mere presence was imposing. And unlike Louis, it was very friendly to strangers, even letting her pet it, which completely annoyed its counterpart. Durna was startled, but Licia told her not to stop, to keep petting Kaisen. It was a clear message, intended to make Louis understand that if it didn't cooperate, the person who had been focusing only on it might turn to another dragon. To be honest, this was indeed the truth, a decision that had been brewing for some time. If Louis didn't change its attitude, even if Durna changed her mind, Licia would still do what she had to do. Honestly, she was playing a dangerous game now. Kaisen wouldn't forget this disrespect. Louis needed to learn its place in the non-dragon hierarchy and not be rude to the boss. It seems it finally figured out who the boss was here. Louis even broke down and cried from the stress, and Durna didn't want to leave it, but Licia made the girl go. As soon as they were out of the room, Licia asked the alchemist if she was okay. She was fine, because she had drunk a courage potion earlier. All in all, she had done an excellent job today, and now she could visit Louis's enclosure once a week. And the girl didn't need to worry about the dragon's health, because Licia would personally see to everything. Meanwhile, a satisfied Kaisen sauntered back to the trainer. Seeing how carefully Licia handled the huge dragon, Durna also asked her to take care of Louis. The alchemist had nothing to worry about in that regard. Now was the dragon's turn to be nervous. And so, a week flew by. Everything was going smoothly, but then Durna came running over, looking incredibly worried. She was very worried about her dragon, like whether it was eating well, getting enough exercise, in short, how it was doing. There were too many questions, so Licia thought it would be easier to just show the results. And to be honest, she wasn't entirely sure herself. Durna was very stressed, because if this method didn't work, who knew what would happen next? But as soon as the dragon saw its owner, it immediately rushed over and rested its head against the bars. She really didn't want to roar anymore. She cried, begging to go to her mom. Durna didn't understand what was wrong with her dragon, but Licia told her to say some sweet nothings to Louis. But before she could say a word, the dragon showed submission, acknowledging her as its master. Everything was fine. Licia just made Louis understand that the only one who truly loved her was Durna. In fact, the trainer's methods were quite drastic, and now it was up to the alchemist to build a trusting relationship with the dragon. The girl was very grateful for Licia's hard work. She was also proud of herself for successfully handling her first crisis in this new job. Just then, she noticed Bruce and several of his assistants walking towards her. Each assistant wanted to express their admiration for Licia's work. It was then she remembered that she had been too busy and had forgotten her appointment with the Duke, and she desperately needed Bruce's help now. He immediately guessed she was probably going to bring up the certification. Exactly. Licia wanted to help the interns get their official trainer licenses because every intern here had the experience and skills to be a fully qualified trainer. The only thing they lacked was the certificate. Once everyone had their certificates, the difference between interns and official trainers would disappear, at least in terms of treatment. Besides, if these people didn't get certified, they would all be kicked out of the duchy, and Bruce knew this was very likely to happen. The guy thanked Licia for her offer, but thought it was too much of a burden for him. Licia tried to figure out why he felt that way. The thing was, he had no wife or children. He had enough money, and science was never his strong suit. But this was a big deal. The Duke never made empty promises. So why didn't Bruce understand? Maybe he understood, but like the other assistants, his work experience here was too specialized. Did all the interns think this way? As it turned out, they did, and that was a problem that would make everyone's life harder. But Licia wasn't one to back down. She was determined to make sure all the assistants got certified and continue to work here. She knew how much effort everyone put into caring for the duchy's dragons, so she was prepared to help them all get that piece of paper. The girl pleaded with Bruce as best she could, not realizing the problem was something else entirely. To be honest, everyone wanted the certification, but Licia was swamped, so they didn't have the heart to ask her for help. I mean, she had to check on every dragon every day, correct Louis's behavior, and even walk Kaisen. Everyone respected her because she had succeeded where they had failed, making progress with the duchy's affairs. Licia hadn't expected to be so valued here. She hadn't done anything special, just helped the dragons and their owners. Besides, she was happy and didn't want to lose the people who worked here. Most importantly, if they were all fired, she would definitely be worked to death. Finally, they understood each other. Licia agreed to train the assistants 3 nights a week. Bruce and Licia shook hands on the deal. Night fell, and Durna walked through the castle corridors, feeling incredibly happy. Before today, she had often thought about giving up on Louis and ending the struggle for both of them. To be honest, she was completely exhausted by the dragon's distrust and aggression. Even now, Louis still scared her a little. The memory of that bloody incident was still fresh. But now she could pet the dragon's nose, which was a huge victory. Just then, she saw the Duke in the corridor. The meeting was no accident. She was bringing him what he had asked her to prepare earlier. Albrant noticed Durna's joy, which she couldn't hide. Licia had really done it. The Duke had no doubt about it. He had found himself a remarkable trainer. At that moment, Durna followed the man's gaze and saw Licia teaching her assistants. More importantly, she had promised to train these newcomers, and in exchange, she would look after Louis. This time, the Duke knew he had struck gold and brought it back to the duchy. It was an interesting conversation, but Durna looked closely at Albrant and realized he still wasn't sleeping well. This was definitely rude, and he had no intention of admitting his weakness or talking about it. But he stopped himself. Yes, the medicine barely worked, and he could only really sleep when he was next to Kaisen. This was a problem. Durna understood completely, but she didn't know how to help Albrant. Meanwhile, Licia went to feed Kaisen and saw her esteemed employer sprawled out and fast asleep next to the dragon. He looked so sweet and vulnerable like that. It was hard not to reach out and touch his handsome face. If only this guy wasn't always so tough. No, she had been sitting here, staring for too long. It was time to wake up, Sleeping Beauty. That was a very bad decision. If it hadn't been for Kaisen, she would be dead by now. Even so, the Duke's blade had grazed her neck. Now she had to figure out who to blame and what to do next. Although Licia was terrified, she apologized to the Duke first. After all, she was the one who had approached and startled him while he was sleeping. Just then, Albrant noticed she was injured. He knew he was responsible and needed to get a healer to check on her. But she didn't want to see a doctor, thinking the wound would heal before the wedding. But looking at him, she realized he was genuinely worried. Besides, he looked completely out of it, so she tried to bring him back to reality. Slowly, the guy started to come to his senses, realizing he was at home with Kaisen and Licia. Apparently, Albrant had remembered something from his past that wasn't easy. He was terribly pale. It was as if Licia had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. As she awkwardly looked away, Albrant swept her up in his arms and carried her to a healer. Licia wished more than anything that he would put her down. The bleeding had stopped, and this was completely unnecessary. However, no one listened to her. The most important thing was to treat her wound as soon as possible to avoid scarring. Even if they didn't see a priest, they still had to treat that wound. It was an order, not up for debate. But Licia resisted, saying she needed to feed Kaisen first, which earned her a vicious growl. The Duke began to relent, realizing that no matter how much he forced her, Licia wouldn't see a healer fine. Then he was willing to talk about any topic she wanted. Licia had no intention of talking about the injury, but she didn't want to be carried either. Although he hated it, he gave in. Now they were back at the castle, where the butler greeted them. This was perfect for Albrant, so he ordered a servant to fetch a priest to treat Licia's wound. The butler was terrified. He didn't know what had happened and was very worried about the girl. No one said anything about it, and Albrant even ordered that the tamer be well fed and watered. Licia didn't expect to be cared for like a princess, but besides food and treatment, the Duke also had the butler give Licia something. It turned out Kazina had already been fed, and Louis was also being looked after by her former trainer, so she could eat in peace without worrying. She felt this was the Duke's way of apologizing, but it felt a bit too extravagant. She thought the guy would quickly forget about it, but this time she was clearly mistaken. She didn't think Albrant needed to be so worked up about it. The guy thought she would question him about why he slept with the dragon, but she didn't. But Licia just laughed. Some might find her strange, but she completely understood why the Duke would sleep on his dragon scales. That wasn't the answer he expected, but the reason he slept next to the dragon wasn't because of its scales at all, but for a completely different reason. He still couldn't fully trust Licia. The scars left by other tamers were too deep, so in that moment, drawing the knife and then feeding and treating her seemed like the right decision. But why was his heart beating so fast now? A new day dawned, and Licia now understood how difficult it was to train others. They needed more resources on dragon riding, and to be honest, her assistants were still clueless about many things. She could go to the library, but there was no guarantee it had all the books she needed. Still, she had to go and see. It was about time to get Kaisen ready for socialization, and Licia needed information on Agric dragons. This meant it was time to talk to Albrant, who was already outside walking Kaisen. Strangely, after the incident with the drawn knife, Licia still felt very awkward around him. Licia knew that many records of Agri dragons had been lost, so she needed the Duke's knowledge, everything he had learned from raising his own dragon. The guy was actually willing to share everything he knew, so there was no need to be nervous. Licia knew the Duke's experience was the most important thing right now, but she wasn't used to being taken care of. Still, the feeling was quite nice, and it didn't get in her way. Overall, her request sounded reasonable, but she wasn't sure if the Duke trusted her enough to share information. However, while the guy was in a good mood, she decided to ask for permission to build a training enclosure and use storage space. The idea was interesting, so the Duke gave instructions to the butler about the library, but he needed to think about the enclosure. Besides, she had said Kuzan should live with the other dragons, and now she had changed her mind. That's right, but he would only live with the other dragons after being trained and socialized, because he had strong likes and dislikes. This could very well be the reason Licia was working so hard, and she didn't deny it because it was one of the reasons she agreed to become the duchy's private tamer. Rowanus understood the girl's thinking, but he also knew that his dragon was deeply moved by her attempt to retrain Louis. But that wasn't the real issue, because Louis was female, so Kaisen was just giving her more attention and patience. The Duke realized his favorite dragon had taken an interest in a female of another species. The very idea really annoyed the dragon. He became very agitated, and it was hard to tell if he was angry or just embarrassed. Licia watched Kaisen's reaction closely, as she had never seen anything like it before. And Kaisen had always told his master he didn't like any females. But if that was the case, the tamer couldn't understand why he was acting out of character. Night fell, and Albrant learned that Licia was in the library. It was strange. The girl was practically living there every day. On one hand, he felt it was foolish to spy on her, but on the other, he couldn't fully trust her. So he wouldn't let her out of his sight. In his territory, you had to be vigilant at all times. But according to the information he had gathered on the girl, she was only interested in dragons and seemed to have no ulterior motives. He wondered again, could he really trust Licia? Or was this just another woman's trick? But many other tamers had seemed harmless at first, only to show their true colors later. If this girl hurt Kaisen, he would never forgive her. Just then, Baskel walked into the protagonist's office with a stack of documents. He wasn't alone. Emerald was with him. The leopard hound was very beautiful, but you could tell she still wasn't used to her surroundings, hiding from others most of the time. Moreover, she wasn't affectionate with people, only eating after her master left, basically showing her distrust in every way. As a result, Baskel sometimes even forgot he owned such a magnificent creature. At this moment, however, she was nudging his leg with her nose, trying to get his attention. This behavior was completely out of character for her, so Baskel was surprised. But that wasn't the point right now. He had brought his Duke a stack of documents to review. Basically, all these documents showed an increase in efficiency in managing the dragons and their tamers. A lot of it was about Licia's successes, but the Duke's concern was whether she could be trusted. His friend's opinion was important. He was afraid she would betray them sooner or later. Unfortunately, Pascal couldn't give a completely certain answer, nor could he be sure she would. Seeing his old friend's hesitation, Pascal suggested continuing to observe Licia. Besides, he had a few questions for her about Emerald's training. The guy hoped that such a talented person wouldn't end up being a backstabber. So if Rohanus had trouble deciding, he could leave the matter to him. The next day, Pascal went to find Lydia, asking for her help in training a tracking leopard. The girl was happy to help the young man, as she was also interested in that kind of creature. Well, the situation was a bit strange, because tracking leopards don't usually abandon their masters. But for some reason, his leopard was nowhere to be found. That's why she wanted to understand the details first, because as far as she knew, no one had ever had problems with a tracking leopard. The guy was silent for a second, then he summoned Emerald. It turned out he had misspoken. There was nothing wrong with Emerald herself. The problem was with him. The guy couldn't always understand his pet's mood, and the leopard only opened up when they were alone, but such moments were very rare. Then, without any warning, the leopard walked up to the protagonist and started sniffing her hand. At first, Baskel wanted to stop her, but Licia didn't let him. Then she sat down next to the leopard and began to listen to her. Emerald liked this and gave Licia an approving nudge. To be honest, Baskel hadn't expected Emerald to approach the tamer first. More importantly, Licia wanted him to specify the task. She needed to figure out what this dragon liked and disliked. He couldn't answer. He felt they were just roommates. He provided the leopard with shelter and food, and she protected him. Licia read between the lines, so she asked if she could observe Emerald to pick up on her signals. This was exactly what Baskel wanted, so she got all the permission she needed. In that case, he would need to stay by the girl's side for a while. Despite their agreement, Licia had a strange feeling about it, and so the observation began. Bakal thought if she were a spy, she would try to steal the documents I deliberately left in plain sight. But she didn't do anything of the sort, and he couldn't understand why Rowanus was so wary of her. It was clear to everyone that she was only interested in dragons. Even now, no matter where she looked, her gaze would always end up back on Emerald. The only thing he figured out was that she didn't like being indoors, but he was surprised when she came to some conclusions about his situation. So Licia went up to the young man and told him that every time Emerald looked at him, he needed to pet her, because that's the most effective way to show your affection. You have to understand, unlike His Highness's dragon, which is like a big dog that comes right over when it wants to be petted, but Emerald isn't so open with her feelings. Her emotions are harder to catch, so it was normal that the guy couldn't fully understand her. Now was the perfect chance to take the first step. Go pet the leopard. Bakal did as he was told, and Emerald started acting more affectionately toward her master. Just then, Licia pulled Bakal away from petting the leopard and asked him if Emerald had changed much as she grew up. It was quite difficult for the young man to gauge how introverted his dragon was. But compared to when she was little, she had become much more withdrawn. She used to be a cute and playful kitten, but now she was an adult predator standing before them. Now she was majestic and awe-inspiring, but still with that hard-to-approach attitude. Licia was well aware that even if she was calmly accepting her master's pets now, she was still a dragon capable of tearing anyone to shreds. It occurred to her that the young man could put down his work from time to time and take his dragon for a walk. The surprise on his face was obvious, but she insisted. Although the man didn't want to listen, he had no choice but to go outside for some fresh air with the tamer and the dragon. The girl was glad to get some fresh air as she had been exhausted from staying indoors observing Emerald all the time. Licia could clearly see the leopard benefiting from the walk. She loved the feeling of the grass on her soft paws. In that moment, Baskel began to realize that he really hadn't been giving the dragon much of his time, because he was too busy. Licia understood perfectly well that the Duke's personal assistant spent too much time on work. And looking at her master, the leopard wasn't asking for much from him. Listen, a man has to realize that if a leopard is relaxing at his feet, he needs to put down his work and give her all the attention he can. He needed to pet her, maybe give her a snack, or better yet, take her for a walk. For now, that would be enough. Besides, if a man showed a little more affection during a walk, it would be a win-win for everyone. Even now, if Pascal looked closely, he would see a happy dragon lady. Just then, the guy noticed that observing his pet was very hard work for Licia. But she handled the situation like an expert. The truth was, the problem wasn't with Emerald, but that Baskel didn't know how to approach her, so he needed to turn to Licia for everything. He suddenly burst out laughing, saying that Licia was a remarkable person. Then he bowed deeply, offering her his sincerest apologies. The truth was, he had only asked for advice so he could spend time with her. It was a nice thing to say, but Licia knew it was all about keeping her under surveillance. It was strange why the guy confessed everything so easily. It was simple. He had found her to be a dragon-obsessed person who walked the straight and narrow, not a backstabber. The words stung a little, and she was about to leave, but Baskel stopped her and asked if she knew why the Duke had entrusted Emerald to him. It wasn't just for safety, but because His Highness didn't trust anyone in the duchy. Besides, Pascal bet she had already heard the story of Albrant. Louiswis was executed along with his wife, and then power fell into the hands of 12-year-old. So every noble considered it their duty to try and pull him from his seat. So Baskel completely understood how hard it was to live under suspicion. But Rannis had no other choice. The story was interesting, but Licia didn't understand why he was telling her all this. It was simple. If Licia were just an ordinary person, Bosco wouldn't have bothered. But she had been desperately training assistants, helping Durna, and many other things. Moreover, she had never touched any of the important documents in the guy's office that happened to prove she wasn't in it for the money and that she was trustworthy. Licia needed to understand that Rohans would be suspicious of her for a long time. It even took him several years to win back my trust. Still, he asked Licia to understand his old friend's caution and not to take it to heart. Just then, Duke Albrant appeared in the park. The guy didn't understand what scene he had stumbled upon. Why was his best friend on one knee before his personal magical beast tamer? He was clearly not happy with the sight. It was work hours, and Licia and Baskel should have been working, not loitering. The girl tried to explain that Baskel had asked her for some tips on dragon training, which infuriated the Duke. The guy felt that she was clearly not busy enough. That was the first time Licia felt a certain sinister aura from Rohanus. He continued, pointing out how she was quietly bringing the dragons under her command, as if he had completely underestimated her skills. But that wasn't it at all. She had agreed to help Lord Baskel only because he needed some guidance. The guy wasn't buying it, saying no one would waste a whole week sticking to Baskel's side for just a few words of advice. That kind of sarcastic remark really annoyed Licia. Seeing that the situation was about to get out of hand, Baskel intervened, saying that Licia was helping him with Emerald, which was why they were getting along so well. Besides, Baskel was already on thin ice for not submitting his report to the Duke on time, so maybe he could turn a blind eye this once. A part of the Duke completely understood, but another part of him was struggling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Licia could sense something was wrong, so she told Rohans to just say it if he had a problem with her. He said nothing, just turned and walked away, leaving her completely confused. What's more, this kind of thing would happen often from now on, and Licia would have to endure some injustice. It all sounded as if she should pack her bags, resign, and flee the duchy. But she couldn't really run away, because Kaisen had accepted her, just as he had accepted the Duke all those years ago. And this was perhaps the most important point, because the Duke had spent his life taking risks, unable to trust anyone, always on guard against betrayal. But Kaisen had always been by His Highness's side, and now he had accepted Licia too. Now the girl was beginning to understand Albrant a little, living in a world where he could only trust his own dragon. On second thought, the Duke's life could be the blueprint for a protagonist in some novel, and she had totally read that story. She was so lost in thought that she didn't even notice the Duke stopping in front of her. His flight for the day was over, so Kaisen could be taken back to the enclosure. Suddenly, the guy asked her if she had successfully trained Emerald, as Pascal had requested. The question was strange, and she didn't see why she had to answer him. Still, she replied that there were no major problems between Baskel and his dragon, so they didn't need further behavioral adjustments. But if Emerald wasn't a tracker, and if Lord Baskel hadn't raised her from a young age, things could have gone south quickly. Licia also thought that Baskel had too much on his plate and simply had no time for the dragon. Emerald was loyal to the guy, seeing him as a parent, but who knew how long that would last. But if Lord Baskel had more time to care for Emerald, there wouldn't be any problems. The point was interesting, but Licia had overstepped. Yes, she was the royal tamer now, but that didn't give her the right to meddle in things that weren't her business. Still, maybe she had her reasons. Licia had no idea what the young man was talking about. The guy meant, I hired you to train dragons, not to get distracted by messy affairs. Just then, some very nasty ideas flooded her mind, and she blew up at the Duke. She didn't have a single second to think about that kind of thing. How could he even imagine it? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that there was absolutely no way she and Baskel could have anything going on. Besides, her schedule was packed, leaving absolutely no room for romance, yes. It was her first time encountering a tracking leopard, and she had almost no time to study it, so the Duke's complaints were out of line. Listen, she was hired as a tamer, and that's what she had been doing. He needed to get it straight that she was here as a tamer, not some damsel in distress. She had been dedicated to her work and planned to continue being so. So if Rohanus had even a shred of respect for her as a tamer, he would never make that kind of insinuation again. After talking with her, the Duke was distraught. He couldn't even focus on important documents. For a moment, he felt like he was going crazy. He didn't know why he had said those things to Licia, especially after knowing Pascal's plan. But for some reason, seeing them together just didn't sit right with him. The worst part was Licia was smiling at his friend, and it irritated him. He felt like he was going crazy from these stupid thoughts. He had learned the hard way never to open his heart to anyone. Letting his guard down was a death sentence. He had tried to trust others many times, but every single time he was burned, betrayed, deceived, or stabbed in the back. But this time, Licia had struck a nerve, a part of him he thought was long dead. More importantly, when she got angry at him for the first time and clearly drew a line between herself and Pascal, the Duke felt a wave of relief. Now that he had calmed down a bit, he realized he had one more reason to apologize to Licia. It was easier said than done, though. Time passed, and she kept trying to avoid her boss, but hey, work was work. More importantly, they were heading to a business meeting with Eukander. He was the one who was going to build the enclosure for His Highness's dragon. The only problem was Eukander couldn't read blueprints, so Licia had to explain everything to him as if he were a 5-year-old. They quickly decided on the placement of the gates, cages, and water troughs, but Licia asked the man to add a transparent wall outside the cages. The main goal of the upcoming training was to let the dragons get to know each other. If there was an extra barrier that allowed them to see and smell each other, things should go very smoothly. Both Licia and the Duke were lost in thought and didn't realize they were standing too close, jumping apart as if burned. They then tried to cover up the awkwardness with business. The Duke was prepared to spend a fortune on sturdy materials, and they would use magic to make the walls transparent. They finished their discussion, and Eukander immediately sensed the atmosphere between them. In that moment, Licia just wanted to disappear into thin air. Rowanus also felt something was a bit strange, so he wanted to clear some things up. Licia had no idea what he was going to say this time, but he just remained silent. The way he was dragging out the conversation was strange. She didn't know he was struggling internally, trying to overcome his own issues to talk about what had happened. After mustering his courage, he managed to squeeze out a word of apology. The guy remembered every hurtful thing he had said to her, so he felt he had to apologize. A part of her accepted his apology, but another part knew he didn't really have anything to apologize for. Yes, she had a bad day, but she was just an employee, and the Duke didn't need to bow to her so easily. I mean, if the only tamer in the entire duchy wasn't considered top tier, it would make her judgment look like trash. To be honest, wasn't the first time she'd heard such things, so she was used to it. Her response was colored by some bad experiences at Usher, but she sincerely apologized to the guy for her outburst, so he shouldn't have stooped to her level. Overall, her experiences with nobles had been quite bad, but looking at the Duke, she couldn't help but apologize. He was different. He saw things from a different perspective. He valued tamers because not many people could handle a Grix dragons. Moreover, he knew he had messed up, had no right to say those things, and hoped Licia would forgive him. It was hard to stay angry at a Duke like that, so her heart softened a little. So the conflict was basically over, but they both still felt a bit awkward. The girl left, and Rohanus was lost in thought, completely unsure of his feelings for Licia. Was he just excited about finding a good tamer, or was there a deeper reason? Meanwhile, the dragon training program was in full swing. Licia watched the whole process from the sidelines. Durna was with her, keeping a close eye on the training, especially worried about the trainee trying to ride the wild running dragon. He was improving every minute. That's why Licia wasn't worried at all. She was proud of her student, who had successfully tamed the wild running dragon. The certificate didn't matter. His experience was the key to success. Overall, Licia was pleased with her students and the progress they were making. The fact was, the kid hadn't even made a mistake, so he had nothing to be nervous about. And another trainee was getting ready to ride another dragon. Besides, she was curious to learn her students' secrets to use in her own training. Then she suddenly felt unwell and her nose started bleeding, but she insisted she was fine and told everyone to calm down. Just then, all the other students rushed to her side. They thought she was pushing herself too hard and was simply exhausted, which was why her nose was bleeding. But she held up a hand and told everyone not to make a fuss. She was perfectly fine. She told them all to go back to what they were doing, but no one wanted to leave. They all wanted to help. The problem was, she didn't need a doctor, but it would be great if someone could help feed the dragons. Now only Lady Durna was left by Lithia's side, rummaging through her magic box for a hemostatic potion. Strangely, Lydia wasn't tired enough to get a nosebleed, but all things considered, at some point, it seemed she felt a bit overwhelmed. To make matters worse, this started happening more and more often, even when she was just doing paperwork. If the Duke found out about this, he would be terrified. At that very moment, a drop of blood fell on the table. Fortunately, That was all, and the exam questions weren't ruined. She was well aware that the exam had to be held in the spring, so there wasn't much time. There were some very promising kids among the students, and if some of them could get their licenses and stay in the duchy, it would be a huge help to the Duke. She was so lost in thought that she didn't see Pascal in front of her and bumped right into him. He was worried about Licia, but she told him she was fine. Just a little nosebleed. It happens all the time. But Pascal didn't think so. The girl's face was too pale. But Licia ignored the comment, made an excuse about having something urgent to do, and left. Just then, she couldn't help but remember the Duke's suggestive insinuations, which made the whole situation even worse. It was just that she was walking too fast and suddenly felt a wave of dizziness. To make matters worse, her nose started bleeding again, and she thought, what on earth is wrong with me? It was clear her body couldn't take the stress anymore, and she needed to rest as soon as possible. But she passed out before she could even make it to her room. Meanwhile, the Duke was relaxing in the park with Kaisen, but his peace was broken by one of Lithia's students. The Duke didn't pay him much mind at first, until Kaisen suddenly became very agitated and started to roar. So the Duke jumped on its back, and they flew toward the castle. The guy had no idea what was wrong with his dragon. He had never seen it like this before. As they got closer, the reason became clear. It was Licia lying there unconscious. Albert held her tightly, completely unaware of what had happened. Kaisen was just as restless, growling and trying to convey its distress. Looking at his winged companion, Rehanes knew they had to get Licia to a healer immediately. In the blink of an eye, a team of healers rushed into the room to give our girl the help she needed. They sprang into action immediately, with the Duke watching their every move. After a while, the examination was over, and the guy demanded they explain what exactly was wrong with the magical beast tamer. By all accounts, the girl was completely exhausted, and if it weren't for her naturally strong constitution, she would have fainted long ago, so now she desperately needed to recover. More importantly, she needed at least a week of bed rest. Albrant completely agreed, ordering the healers to make sure she rested well, was not allowed out of bed, and didn't even think about rushing back to work. If she threw a fit, one of them was to call for him. The doctors assumed the Duke was worried because Licia was the only beast tamer in the duchy, but things were far more complicated than that. Just then, Kuzan's head poked through the window, worried sick about Licia. The guy understood how his dragon felt and tried to reassure it that the girl would be fine. Morning came, and Licia woke up to find herself not in her own room again. Just then, a doctor came in and told her she was in the infirmary, brought there by the Duke after he found her collapsed. Hearing this, Licia leaped out of bed, ready to quickly get dressed and return to her duties. But her plan was thwarted by the Duke, who suddenly appeared in the room and stopped her. Right now, the Duke couldn't care less if Licia wanted to work. Her health was what mattered most, and the doctors believed she needed more rest. So the guy carried her back to bed, and just then, Kuzan's snout appeared at the window. It missed the girl so much it couldn't wait to give her a kiss. No one expected that. Licia knew the dragon in her charge was upset, so she decided to soothe it. Meanwhile, the doctor couldn't figure out how on earth a dragon got into the clinic. The tamer was pretty sure Kuzan had thrown a huge tantrum until the Duke finally agreed to bring it along. That much was obvious. But she needed to realize that if she didn't take care of herself, she'd be stuck in the infirmary for a very, very long time. The doctors and Licia reached a compromise, but the dragon had to leave as soon as possible. Left alone in the room with him, she promised him she would take better care of herself from now on. Just then, Licia screamed when she discovered all her study materials were ruined. But not to worry, because the Duke had gathered the documents, folded them, and handed them over to Bruce. She was excited by this news on one hand, but she also knew she was the only licensed beast tamer in the entire duchy. That was an easy fix. They would just hire more tamers. Of course, Licia was stressed about it, but that was the man's problem, and he would solve it. She needed to focus on her recovery, not bother herself with things she didn't need to worry about at all. For a moment, she wondered if the Duke was worried about her, or just giving her a hard time. A whole week passed, and Licia was still stuck in the infirmary, which meant both Kuzan and Rohanis were very frustrated. He knew the dragon missed its tamer, but if he went to the infirmary, her recovery time would be prolonged even further. So it just plopped down on the floor, sulking with its back to its master. The Duke thought to himself that he'd been completely tied up lately, unable to even do his own work because he had to take care of Kuzan all by himself. But Lithia's absence due to illness wasn't just a huge blow to the Duke. Everyone in the castle felt it. Things weren't going smoothly at the training center either, as Louis's training had been suspended. It felt like the entire duchy was about to collapse without Licia, even though they had basically just returned to square one. But the guy wasn't backing down. The girl needed to rest and recover, even if it meant everyone else had to pick up the slack. Because she wasn't just the only licensed zookeeper, but also a smart and upright woman. More importantly, Rohani's at that moment finally realized that he really missed her. So he decided to go see her, but he didn't want to bring Kuzan along. He finally admitted to himself that his conscience was tormenting him because he had pushed her too hard without knowing the full situation. But as he rushed towards the infirmary, he saw Licia taking a walk in the park with Baskel and Emerin, which made him furious, as he believed she should be resting in the infirmary, not strolling in the park with his deputy. The situation was awkward, so Baskel tried to ease the tension. But Albrant wasn't having it. He wanted to know why Licia wasn't in bed. It turned out the healers had allowed the girl to get some fresh air in the park. Baskel added that being cooped up indoors all the time wasn't good for any patient, no matter who they were. But His Grace the Duke wasn't buying it. This walk also involved a dragon, and Licia was a dragon tamer, so he found it hard to believe she was resting. Just then, the girl hugged the Black Panther tightly. She hadn't seen a dragon in days, and she was genuinely happy. So there was no way she was giving this cute little dragon back to the Duke. Seeing how much Licia liked Emerin, Albrant let Baskel leave the panther with the girl for a while. Except Licia didn't want to separate the panther from its master, which meant Baskel had to stay. As soon as she said it, she realized how ambiguous that sounded. Rohani's face showed he was not happy. He was absolutely furious. So he started pressuring the girl again, saying they would prolong her recovery time if she didn't go back to her room. Just then, Baskel stepped in to smooth things over. The guy reminded his friend that too much bed rest wasn't good either, which was why the doctors had agreed to let Licia go to the park. Then he leaned in and whispered that people need to say what they feel, or no one will understand. It was solid advice that the Duke needed to think over. Just then, Baskel walked into his office with some documents, apologizing for being late. The Duke wasn't about to waste time on small talk, so he got straight to the point. He wanted to hire another beast tamer, but it was very difficult because they needed someone with a clean record. And to be honest, the chances of finding another tamer like Licia were slim. Albrant was well aware of this, but he didn't need another Licia. He needed someone who could support her. That's when Baskel pointed out that no one could read Rohani's mind, especially when it came to Licia. In other words, the guy needed to stop digging his own grave and be more honest. But as usual, the young man pretended not to understand what his old friend was saying. But Baskel reminded him that if he had just said he was worried about the girl's health back then, she would have accepted his concern. All right. Putting feelings aside, it was time to talk business, namely, finding a tamer. The Ashar Taming Center seemed like a good place. Yes, the director was taking kickbacks from some count who helped his son, but no other issues were found during the audit. So the Duke planned to go there to find some suitable tamers. Moreover, the Duke also intended to take Licia with him when he went to this training center. Baskel knew the Duke didn't really need to take Licia, but the young man was still too dense to understand his own true feelings. Another 5 days passed, and Licia was discharged from the infirmary. The first thing she did was go see Kuzan. The dragon was super happy to see her too, and they started hugging, just so damn happy. The girl thanked the dragon for finding her unconscious and bringing her to the infirmary. Only now did she realize how badly she had scared the strong, handsome dragon by letting it see someone it cared about bleeding profusely. So now she could let him throw a little tantrum and vent his emotions from the past few days. Besides, she just had a brilliant idea. They could fly together. It was the best decision she had made in a while, and it made them both very happy. Flying with Kuzan was an exquisite and ultimate pleasure for Licia. Duke Albrant watched them from the ground with a smile. As soon as they landed back on solid ground, Licia noticed they weren't alone in the forest clearing. The young man reminded her that she had just left the infirmary, so she needed to take care of herself and not jump right back into work. Licia knew the Duke sounded cold, but deep down he was really worried about her. She didn't feel pressured, though. She hadn't flown in so long, and it felt amazing to be high in the sky with Kuzan. A man might misunderstand this, but for now, Licia planned to pause the dragon feeding and focus on training. If that was the case, she could just take Kuzan and go home, and Rohanis could handle the rest himself. It was clear Licia had completely misunderstood the guy's good intentions and was offended. Even so, the Duke stopped her and told her he was going to the imperial capital soon. He was going there to find some top tamer candidates for his duchy, and he wanted Licia to help with the selection. This was completely unexpected, and she wasn't quite sure how she could help the Duke. But her involvement was a done deal. They would head to the capital in 3 weeks, and before then, she needed to regain her strength. Just then, the Duke saw her happy smile and knew he had made the right decision. Time flew by, but her assistants wouldn't let her study for her exam or even go near the dragon feeding area. They all thought they were doing the right thing, especially since Licia had already fainted from overwork once, and they would never let that happen again. The rest was certainly doing her good, but now, looking at the Duke, she had a bad feeling. Seriously, she couldn't figure out why she had a ride in the carriage with him instead of looking after Kuzan. He didn't care that Licia didn't want to ride with him. For her, sitting face to face with her boss was pure torture. But she had to obey her employer's orders. At least Kuzan seemed very calm, even though its special training hadn't even begun. Besides, several assistants were escorting them on dragon beasts. All in all, this trip was destined to be an unforgettable experience. Rohani suddenly realized Licia might be very uncomfortable riding with him, so they would need to arrange for another carriage for the return trip. She had finally fallen asleep, so it was very likely a second carriage wouldn't be needed at all. But he was worried she was uncomfortable, so he decided to slightly adjust her position on the seat. Just then, they hit a rock, and the carriage jolted. But the young man managed to pull the girl closer to keep her from falling, except she started acting a bit strange, kissing his shoulder. It was just a simple gesture, yet it stirred up an unprecedented storm of emotions in his heart, feelings that were difficult to control and understand. So at some point, he gently pushed Licia away, explaining that the carriage had hit a bump and a wheel had jumped. Besides, they were almost at the capital, so it was time to wake up anyway. As they entered the city, Licia realized the training center they were heading to was Ashar, the place where she used to work. The man explained that they were only here because the center was protected by the Empire, so it was less likely to have shady dealings than other places. Licia didn't entirely agree that the place was clean, but she wasn't going to argue with her boss and went to check on Kuzan. She told the dragon to be calm and not to scare the humans or other dragons. Just then, her old friend from her time at Ashar came running towards her. She was happy to see her old friend, but then Rohani's appeared behind her, completely ruining the mood. Licia had to settle Kuzan first, and then go to the director's office, where the Duke was waiting for her. She didn't understand why she had to attend a business meeting. She would much rather stay with her dragon. But halfway to the office, she heard a sickeningly familiar voice. A very detestable voice. It was her arch-nemesis, Thompson. What was he doing here, she wondered. The last she'd heard, he had been fired after that incident. Apparently not. Of course, the guy started spouting nonsense, saying she had charmed the Duke and was now parading around like a master. He assumed that since the girl was back at the training center, the Duke must have kicked her out, so he thought he'd be charitable and take her under his wing. He started approaching her more aggressively, even getting handsy, saying he liked girls with a bit of a temper, the feisty type. But Licia wasn't having any of it. She knew there was nothing worse than relying on a man who had nothing to offer but his family name, because that was his only asset. So he had better stop his creepy behavior right now and let her pass. Better yet, he should go do his actual job, and maybe then he could pass for a halfway decent man. Thompson was so angry he was about to hit Licia, but the punch never landed. Duke Albrant intervened and protected her. Fury burned in his eyes, and his drawn sword showed that this guy wasn't kidding around when it came to protecting what was his.